All right, so I just almost went through all of this after having hit the picture button instead of the video button. So this is the second time through this little lesson here for me. But I did forget to mention Happy Easter. I hope you guys had a wonderful Sunday. But this paper right here, I believe I have shown you how we can solve quadratic equations. We started with graphing. We found the axis of symmetry and the zeros. We went on to square roots and we're thinking, yeah, this is nice. These all work out wonderfully. And then we started adding a few extra terms in there that square rooting just doesn't work. And so we went over completing the square, which works. But remember, there were like 8 steps, a very tedious process. So that was all before spring break. And then we developed the quadratic formula last week on Monday and practiced it Thursday. This is the one that we will frequently use. What I forgot to mention, at least I don't think this was on here earlier, is that last chapter we factored everything. So factoring is probably one of the quickest ways to solve a quadratic equation. The problem is it does not always work because not everything is factorable. So typically, if it does not factor and you're not told that you have to graph it, then you're going to use the quadratic formula. Completing the square comes in when you work with parabolas, and I believe that's in Algebra 2 a little bit more, so that's why we go over that method as well. But the first 4 problems that you will have today, it's the middle column. So Thursday, I think we did the first column. Today, you're going to do the 4 problems in the middle column. And again, I'm going to take a picture, and you're going to have the answers. Please, please, please check your work, because if you are doing these incorrectly, it's not going to benefit you at all. So work it out, check to see that you get the correct answer. And the first 4 are simply quadratic formula problems. The last 3, you get to decide which of these methods you choose to use. Now, I do have 3 example problems here for you, and then the assignment. You'll do the first column in this section, and there's just 3 problems. You can choose what method you want to use. I'm going to try to put it as an assignment where you can submit it, but if it's just as easy to email it to me, I don't care. I just want to make sure that you're showing me these 7 problems that you're practicing. So here is 3. If you want to put these in your notes, you're more than welcome to, but again, these are just practice. So if I were to put this on your homework, x squared plus x minus 6 equals 0, and say, solve this quadratic equation. When I look at this, I recognize that factors of 6 are 1 and 6 and 3 and 2. Well, if I end up having to subtract, because this is a negative 6 right here, 3 times 2, the difference is 1. So I know that this is going to factor. So for me, I would look at this and I would say, okay, here's my x. Remember, the top is your a times your c. The a is going to be a 1. That's your x squared coefficient. The c is your constant. 1 times negative 6 is negative 6. And your b is the coefficient in front of x, which is 1. In order to get 6, when I multiply, I would do 3 times 2. And if it needs to be a negative 6 as I multiply, one of these is going to have to be a negative. Since I want a positive 1, I'm going to make that 2 a negative. So 3 minus 2 is a positive 1, but 3 times a negative 2 is negative 6. And since our lead coefficient was 1, remember, we don't have to do all that extra work of factoring by grouping. If your lead coefficient is 1, you can simply say x plus 3, the quantity, times x minus 2, the quantity. Boy, it's been a while since we've done this. This might be a very good review for us. And we can simply say x plus 3 equals 0. Subtract 3 from both sides, and x is equal to negative 3. X minus 2 equals 0. Add 2 to both sides, and x is equal to 2. So those would be our 2 answers. So on this one, I would factor, just because I like to do that if possible. This second one, x squared minus 9, I noticed, hey, these are perfect squares. So I would square root. And there's two different ways that you can square root this problem. You can simply square root it from this form, or you can add 9 to both sides and square root both sides. So it really, I don't know that it matters. In my experience, as far as teaching algebra, it does not matter. But I would simply say square root of x squared is x, so it goes first in each of the in the parentheses. Square root of 9 is 3, so it goes second in each of the equations. And in order to multiply and end up with a minus sign, one of these was a positive, one of these was a negative. That dropped out our middle term. And I know that then x is either going to be equal to a positive or a negative 3. And I could write out each of those equations and solve them to show this would be negative 3, this would be positive 3. So there's my second example. Third example, as you would guess, I'll go ahead and give you a hint. It's down here, quadratic formula. This one does not factor because, and when you first look at it, you think, well, but 5 times 1 gives me 5, and 5 plus 1 gives me 6. The problem is, remember, when you're factoring or using the quadratic formula, you need to subtract the 5 so that it joins your x squared and your x term. You got to have it in standard form. So x squared plus 6x minus 5 is equal to 0. Well, the only way to get a negative when you multiply is to have one positive and one negative. And so this will not factor because the only way to get 6 is to have the 5 and the 1 to either be both positive or both negative. So this does not factor. You are certainly welcome to use completing the square. I was talking to Riley, who's a senior this year, and she said she has a friend who loves completing the square, like doesn't use quadratic formula, likes completing the square. Because it requires so many steps, most students, that's not their preferred method. And as far as I go, I would rather use the quadratic formula as well. But I am going to write here, remember, it helps so that you can see this. Your a is 1, coefficient of x squared. Your b is 6, the coefficient of your x term. And your c is negative 5. And so now we are ready to use this formula. Put it down here. I don't know if you hopefully have that memorized. To some tune, I don't care what tune you use. Like I say, I used Pop Goes the Weasel, but you're going to have x is equal to the opposite of your b, which would be negative 6, plus or minus the square root. I'm going to square my b, which would be 36, minus, I'm going to take 4, I'm going to multiply it by 1, and I'm going to multiply that by negative 5. So right away, I notice I'm going to have a minus and a negative. When I multiply those, I'm going to end up with a positive underneath that square root. That is all divided by 2a, which is 2 times 1. So x is equal to a negative 6 plus or minus the square root of 36. Like I say, I see this negative and this minus, I'm sorry, this minus and this negative. 4 times 1 times 5 is 20, but a negative and another negative is going to give me a plus 20 under there. And divide that by 2. And negative 6, add or subtract the square root of, when you combine those, you get 56, all over 2. I typed this into the calculator, a negative 6 plus the square root of 56, hit enter, divided by 2, and then I typed negative 6 minus the square root of 56. I divided that by 2. My two answers were 0.74 and negative 6.74. I do also want to do just a quick reminder, because this was before spring break, And I just want to remind you, we can simplify this square root of 56. Remember how you factor tree the 56 into 7 times 8? The 7 is already a perfect square, but the 8 you can do 2 times 4, and you can bring it down one more time. Anytime you have a partner, these two join together, one of them disappears and one of them escapes. So this 2 within your circle can come outside the square root. The poor 7 and the poor 2 didn't make any friends in there, so they are stuck in there. 7 times 2 is 14. So if you were not doing a decimal approximation, this would stay -6 plus and minus. Remember, our 2 escaped. 2, our 14 did not escape, and we would divide that by 2. And I wanted to show you this because at this point, this 6, this outside 2, and this denominator of 2 will all simplify. Not the 14 inside your square root. It's stuck. But you could divide all of these by 2 and get -3 plus or minus the square root of 14. And that would simplify a little bit. So if you needed an exact answer as opposed to a decimal approximation, you would leave it in this form. So there's your quadratic formula again. 4 of them to practice, and then 3 more that you get to choose. And in all honesty, I believe I gave you a square root one, a factoring one, and a quadratic formula, but you can use quadratic formula on all of them if you want to. Just wanted you to practice there a little bit. Remember, Tuesday and Friday at 11 to 1 if you've got any questions, and Thursday at 1 if you just want to kind of visit with the algebra crew.